Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Dollar Dialogue. I'm your host, Supreeth Nagella, and today we're getting into something that sounds simple but actually decides whether countries thrive or completely fall apart. Because here's the question: what happens when a country puts all of its money on one industry? Now, on paper, it makes sense. If you've got oil, you double down on oil, you export it, you make billions, you build your economy around it. Easy, right? But history shows it's not that simple. Today, we're looking at three leaders who all made the same bet, but with very different outcomes. First, you've got Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, who used oil wealth to fund massive social programs but left the economy dangerously exposed. Then, Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, who's trying to use oil money to move away from oil entirely. And finally, Norway, quietly doing something else very different by saving and investing their oil wealth for the long term instead of expending it. So, this episode isn't just about oil, it's about the trade offs. It's about whether leaders can actually think long term or just act in the moment. Today, we have our esteemed hosts, Mr. Zumar Sheikh, Araf Kabir, Zohaan Rana, and Demir Hossain. We also have a new guest speaker, Mr. Ishraq Rayan, who currently takes Economics HL and tutors dozens of students in school to share his love for the subject. Ishraq, do you have anything else you would like to add?
For now, no. We will simply continue along.
Thank you so much, Ishraq. And let's get to it. So, who wants to start off the podcast today?
So I'll take the torch from here. I want to talk about Venezuela's economy first, and the rest of the hosts or Ishraq, if you would like to join, you may talk about Norway or Saudi Arabia. So as we dive into the economies of these three, Venezuela is one of the clearest examples of how heavy dependence on a single resource, which in this case is oil, combined with many different political decisions, can lead to a very big collapse of the country and of the economy itself. The country holds most of the largest proven oil reserves in the world, and for many decades, it's been a very oil-dominated economy, which makes up the mass majority of its export earnings and government revenue. Under Hugo Chavez, who was their head of government at one point, oil income was used to fund large social programs aimed at reducing poverty and inequality, which initially improved living standards. However, the government also increased state control over industries, nationalized businesses, and failed to invest in diversifying the economy. This meant Venezuela became extremely vulnerable to changes in global oil prices. When oil prices fell around 2014, government revenues also collapsed, but spending remained high, which led to massive budget deficits. To cover this, the government printed money, which triggered hyperinflation, which is considered one of the worst in modern history. And after Chavez, the successor was Nicolas Maduro. And when he took over, the situation worsened, with severe shortages of basic goods, a collapsing currency, and a sharp decline in GDP. Political instability, corruption, and international sanctions further deepened the crisis. Today, Venezuela's economy is still heavily reliant on oil but operates far below its potential, showing how lack of diversification, poor economic management, and political factors can turn resource wealth into long-term economic instability. Cut. Would anyone now like to talk about Saudi Arabia? Demir, I think you wanted to talk about it.
Yes. So Saudi Arabia, similarly to Venezuela, has a huge dependency on oil, but a little bit differently. They've been trying to diversify their economy over the last, I would say, 5 years, maybe 5 to 10 years. We know this through their very newfound reliance on tourism, as they're trying to, construct these wonders, such as, I think they're trying to build rivers, like self-sustaining rivers in the desert. And also, we know this from their um, entrance into the sports industry, as they've been heavily in they brought up the investment into sports such as football with the Saudi Pro League, And also they've been trying to be more sustainable with the 2030 vision, as by 2030 they want to be much more reliant on other aspects of their economy with the vision 2030 goals. We also know that they are tied to the US in terms of the petrodollar, as you know, the US kind of controls oil production. But all in all, we see that Saudi has their acts of trying to diversify have somewhat worked in some aspects, but we'll have to see in the future to the extent to which uh, it works. So, would anyone like to add on for Saudi Arabia, or is that it?
Araf,
Anyone?
I think we should now move on to Norway. Araf, would you mind speaking about Norway for a little bit? And I think we'll have our guest speaker talk about some stuff about the country and its economy.
Yeah, no problem. I feel like you guys did a pretty good job in introducing the other countries. For Norway's case, it's pretty interesting because it's often seen as like the best example of how a country manages oil wealth. Because Norway still produces oil, but the key difference here is that they don't fully rely on it the same risky way as other countries. So, just to give a little background, when Norway first like discovered oil in the late 1960s, the government made like a long-term decision not to spend all the money immediately, but to actually save it and invest it for the future. And furthermore, instead of using all of its oil revenue, Norway puts most of it into like a massive sovereign wealth fund called the Government Pension Fund Global, which is short for like GPFG. And this fund is now worth well over $1 trillion, and it plans to invest in companies all over the world. And right now, the government only spends a small portion of this fund each year, which keeps the economy more stable and protects it from oil price drops. And today, as we know, Norway is a very like stable country with a stable economy, high living standards, and also like have a strong public service. So Norway basically shows us that it's not just having about like resources; it's also about how a country should manage them for the long term. So that's pretty interesting.
Araf,
Um,
sorry, Ishraq, before you begin, I just wanted to ask Araf something, and in fact, all of you guys something. The leadership within Norway, within Saudi Arabia, and within Venezuela is quite different. One could say that Venezuela and Saudi Arabia have a very restricted, a very authoritarian government. But when we look at Norway, it's a very democratic state. Do you guys think it has something to do with how these three economies or how these three leaders manage their economy?
I believe that the way the leaders manage the economy is highly has a very great effect on how their future is actually planned out. Such as Venezuela, who actually doubled down on oil. You can see how big they have failed now due to a concept known as the Dutch disease, where if a country like very heavily focuses on one sector for their entire economy, the other sectors actually suffer and they decline, which makes it so that the volatility of oil prices affect everything else. Um, and then you could also see it with Saudi, how they're trying to move away because they've realized how that's also affecting them. And then you can see Norway, whereas they've fully moved away from oil as their main primary source for the economy, and is diversifying in their overall economic like bringers, so that they have multiple different sectors that can bring in revenue for the overall government rather than just overly relying on oil.
Ishak, thank you so much for your expert opinion. Araf, I believe you wanted to say something.
Yeah, going back to your question, Zumar, I feel like it was a pretty interesting way to put it, because this angle that you've mentioned, the government affecting this like whole oil situation in these countries, it's been very interesting, because I feel like they have very different governments, as you said. For example, in Norway, the government is more stable. It has a democracy with strong institutions, transparency, along with like strict rules on how money is used. In contrast, you could see countries like Venezuela faced with like, I would say, political instability with a weaker economic management, and which more like short-term problems. Meanwhile, you also have Saudi Arabia, which is a completely different one, which is a monarchy, and where decisions are more like centralized under leaders like MBS. And this allows like more for like fast change. And like Demir mentioned when he introduced it, the Vision 2030 model, which was basically depending heavily on leadership and direction from the monarchy itself. So that was pretty interesting. I just wanted to put that out there. Thank you.
Just to add on to what everyone said is I think the best part about the Norwegian government is that they've come to the realization that oil is a finite material, meaning that there's a limited amount of it in the world. And that's something that also Saudi Arabia is trying to differentiate by by changing its reliance on just oil to going into tourism. And a good example would be Vision 2030. But we can see that Venezuela has still not diversified in that sense, and they're very reliant on oil. And this leads to other sectors such as the manufacturing sector and the agriculture sector to suffer because there's not enough importance going into those sectors. And this leads to the economy collapsing if oil prices go down. Supreet, I see you have your hand up. Would you like to add anything?
Yeah, for sure, Zohan. Sorry, my mic was not working. But to further specifically analyze Venezuela, we often assume that natural resources can be a guaranteed path to success. And if a country is sitting on massive oil reserves, the logic should feel straightforward: export it, earn revenue, and build a strong, stable economy through diversification. And even if that country is highly reliant on oil and hasn't really diversified like Venezuela, why shouldn't we expect it to still benefit? Because at the end of the day, it has the resource that the world demands. For instance, Venezuela, it's extremely dependent on oil. And yes, it hasn't diversified its economy at all. But it literally holds the largest oil reserve in the entire world. So even without diversification, shouldn't it be able to reap the benefits of that resource? So brings us to a case that really challenges the assumption, and we need to look further back in history. And I'm wondering whether you guys are able to pinpoint the true causes for why Venezuela is unable to reap any benefits, or like not enough benefits, even regardless of its diversification. So this is my major question: if Venezuela has the world's largest oil reserves, why did that same wealth end up destroying its economy?
I believe I could answer this. I think one of the biggest issues over this is the volatility of oil prices in and of itself, and the overall world situation affecting how oil is transferred. Um, and even if like a country is like very highly reliant on a certain single resource, unless their economy is like very new and like very early, they won't like there shouldn't be a need to diversify. uh, and I think that the reason why Venezuela failed in this case is that they weren't able to capitalize completely on their large oil reserves, and like I think that's one of the biggest reasons for failing.
You know, Ishraq, I quite agree with you and with everything that you said. But to be more specific, I just want to add on a little some few facts here. Even without diversification, oil, it may be able to make a country very rich, But when we look at Venezuela as a case study, we can see that it's not always guaranteed. For much of the 20th century, when Venezuela was one of Latin America's or South America's wealthiest countries because of oil, especially after the industry was nationalized in 1976 and placed under the state company PDVSA. Uh, However, this also made the economy heavily dependent on oil, which by the 2000s accounted for over 90% of export earnings. And especially under Hugo Chavez, which was during 1999 through 2013, high global oil prices, especially between 2004 and 2012, brought in massive revenues for the country, which the government used to fund large social programs and subsidies, which I had mentioned earlier. While this did reduce poverty in short term, Chavez also increased state control, dismissed experienced oil engineers after 2003 oil strike, and redirected the nationalized company's profits away from maintenance and reinvestment. As a result, oil prices began to decline even during years of high prices. Crucially, Venezuela did not save uh, this oil income or invest in other sectors, which left the economy in a very exposed position. When global oil prices collapsed in 2014, where it fell from over $100 per barrel to below 50, government revenues dropped sharply, but spending also remained quite high, which again I had mentioned before. And under Nicolas Maduro, which was from 2013 and up until recently, the government responded by printing more money, which led to hyperinflation that peaked around 2018, when inflation reached um, an estimated over 1 million%. At the same time, strict price controls uh, reduced incentives for domestic production, which caused severe shortages of food and medicine, while oil production continued to fall from about 3 million barrels per day in the late 1990s to well under 1 million by the late 2010s, meaning Venezuela wasn't able to fully benefit from its own resources. And I just want to add on by saying additional pressure came from the US sanctions, which started uh, from 2017 to 19, which restricted oil exports and access to financial markets. So even though Venezuela had vast oil reserves, a combination of overdependence, mismanagement, lack of reinvestment, and poor economic policy meant it was not able to reap the full benefits, showing that natural resources alone are not enough, and how they're managed over time is what determines pure economic success. Zohan, would you like to add on?
Beautifully said, Zumar, and thank you for giving me the mic. So, just like how Ishraq said, I would like to talk about the economic volatility for a little bit. The reason why it's a very dangerous game to be reliant on oil for Venezuela is that if prices goes up, obviously the economy will grow and people will flourish. But if the price of oil goes down, the economy will crash. Commonly seen in the oil price collapse in 2014, Venezuela's GDP fell massively, and that led to a huge crisis for the people, leading them to suffer. And we know it's common information that Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world. They boast around 300 billion barrels of oil. But the thing is, with Venezuela's oil reserves is that they have extra heavy crude. So this requires more technologically advanced extractors to actually extract the heavy crude oil. And also, it needs special refineries to make the crude oil usable for other things, such as oil for cars. So even though they have the largest reserves, that doesn't mean they can easily use them. So the point I'm trying to make is that having reserves doesn't always equal to making money. And to talk about diversification again, no diversification basically equals to a dangerous economy. A lot of economists say that don't put all your eggs in one basket, and that's exactly what Venezuela is doing. They're putting all their eggs into the oil industry. And if the oil industry fails, then their economy is finished. That's why they should diversify, focus on farming, focus on the industrial sector. They need to start diversifying more. And yeah.
That was beautifully well said. Ishraq, do you wanna talk more, or should we move on to Supreet? I believe you wanted to say something. You had your hand raised.
Yes, Zumar, thank you very much. So, there's one very important layer that many people really don't know about. And I believe it's really important we discuss it in today's podcast. So, we know we have oil rich countries, and we would imagine something relatively simple. You drill, oil comes out, you probably process it, you sell it, and you make money. But Venezuela's situation is much, much more complicated than that because the majority of its reserves, which is actually around 95%, is made up of something that's classified as heavy or extra heavy crude oil. And this is in the typical liquid fuel and is very thick, dense, almost star like. And in some cases, it's closer to being asphalt than the kind of oil that flows easily out of the ground. And this is where things get even more interesting because when you break it down economically, when we do a price analysis, we see that the problem for Venezuela isn't just its reliance on oil or its mismanagement, but the fact that the oil is far more expensive at every single stage compared to countries like Saudi Arabia or even Norway. Start with extraction. In Venezuela, because the crude is so heavy and viscous, getting it out of the ground is already costly. You need additional technology, additional energy, and more time just to make the oil flow. Compare that to Saudi Arabia. The oil is much lighter and located in easily accessible reservoirs. In some cases, Saudi oil can be extracted for as little as $5 to $10 per barrel. Venezuela, on the other hand, can be looking at $20 to $30 or more per barrel just to get it out of the ground. And then comes the processing, and we know how this gap will further widen because we know how heavy Venezuela's crude oil is, and this would require immense refining to remove impurities and convert it into usable fuel. And we know that these refineries are extra expensive because of how scarce this technology is. And this causes higher costs and fewer potential buyers. And finally, selling the oil. Because Venezuela's crude is harder to refine, it often has to be sold at a massive discount on the global market. And we know buyers know it would cost so much more, even after purchase, to process the crude before use, and thus they are not willing to pay market prices. Meanwhile, other oils are in higher demand because they're easy to refine and it allows for more competitive pricing. So, when you put it all together, we know how Venezuela has a nuance of problems. It spends more to extract, more to process, and then earns way less when it finally sells the oil. And Zoomer, I see you wanted to say something, sir.
Yeah, Supreet, that was beautifully crafted and expressed by you. I want to now bring a question onto our expert here, Ishraq Rayan. Um, Adding on to Supreet as well, when we started talking about how revenues fell or how revenues weren't exactly maximized as it was very costly for them compared to, let's say, Saudi Arabia or Norway, or when oil prices fell, why do you think the government or the head of state, Chavez, decided to spend the same amount of money as they were before, or why do you think they started spending higher?
To answer that question, we need to look at Chavez's leadership, where in this case, as Zohan mentioned earlier about the subsidies and political incentives granted so that he could gain this power over Venezuela and their oil reserves. Um, when the oil prices crashed, these subsidies did not stop, and all of these sort of spending and like as Supreet also mentioned, increase in uh, um, the increase in oil production also did not stop, whereas the oil prices fell and the amount that you needed for per barrel increased um, a due to them not having the best technology and having a a very heavy crude oil. So um, so their spending did not stop, mostly because of the fact that uh, Chavez did not want to stop the subsidies that he was giving out for his own political power and to remain in control, and also the fact that um, the oil production also did not stop whilst being equally as expensive whilst the oil price was falling.
Thank you so much, Ishraq Rayan. That was such an insightful divulsion that you found. I don't think that's a word. I apologize, viewers. But when we take all of this into account, to wrap it up, Venezuela's situation starts to make a bit more sense. It wasn't just about poor decisions or over reliance, it's about being able to adapt to the global conditions while knowing the difficulty with the current resource Venezuela has access to. But this is exactly where other oil affluent countries become more interesting. Because if Venezuela could represent what happens or what it could have been if oil dependence had gone right, then Saudi Arabia represents a different version of the same story. It's another country heavily reliant on oil. It's another economy built around the single resource. But this time, the outcome looks very different. So the question is, what did Saudi Arabia do differently? And further on to talk about this, how was Saudi Arabia able to use its oil in a way where it didn't become heavily dependent on it, but was able to transition to different industries like tourism, manufacturing, and technology, and many other industries? How was it able to diversify in such a smooth, clean transition?
Thank you, Supreet, for the prompt. I just wanted to talk a bit more about Saudi. Because Saudi Arabia, as we know, it's one of the most oil-rich countries in the world, and for decades, its entire economy has been built around oil exports. And oil is basically the backbone of its revenue, and government spending and global influence is also part of that. This created something what we call is called a rentier state, where the government earns most of its money from natural resources instead of taxing its citizens, and this allows for stronger state control and fast wealth distribution. It also means like the economy becomes more heavily dependent on one sector. But the thing with Saudi Arabia, I liked how they diversified some stuff recently, because we could look at how one of the most important parts of Saudi Arabia's strategy is that it didn't just consume all of its oil well, because it actively reused it as capital to build like new industry. For example, a key part of this would be the creation of huge state-backed investment structures like sovereign investment arms, which allowed Saudi Arabia to take oil income and reinvested it to like globally into companies. And this is where like the big shift begins, because oil money is no longer just like income; it becomes like a huge investment capital. And more recently, like MBS and with Vision 2030, that strategy has become more direct, and oil revenue is now being more used to fund entirely new sectors at home, like tourism, entertainment, technology, and like other large infrastructure projects. So like instead of waiting for oil to run out and then changing, Saudi Arabia is actually doing something pretty smart. They're actually trying to actively use its oil wealth as like a bridge into a more diversified economy. And the key idea for this is this, which is oil didn't disappear from the system. It was just used as the engine to like finance this whole economy and this whole country. So Saudi Arabia's strategy is not just about like fully abandoning oil just yet, but it's using it to like leverage to build the next stage of its economy. So that's kind of interesting. And Demir, I see your hand raised there. So would you like to say anything?
I just wanted to thank you so much for your input. And yes, I think we should switch to Demir here. Demir,
Yeah.
please, let's continue about Saudi Arabia.
Okay, so Arv nicely said about the infrastructure aspect. I want to talk about the sports aspect of Saudi Arabia's economy. As we all know, Saudi Arabia has been delving into sports such as football, golf, and the thing about these ventures is it sort of comes off to some news reporters and some citizens of the global population as sports washing. Now, for viewers that don't know, sports washing is a term that is sponsor or host a sports team or sporting event in order to promote a positive public image and distract attention from human rights issues or unethical or criminal activity. So, some people feel that, like, in Saudi doing this and being so heavily reliant on sports, it kind of ruins the authenticity of the sports, as they view it as sports washing. But it has been a somewhat good strategy, I would say, as it is getting the Saudi image out there. And other forms of diversification include Saudi recently having hosted a comedy show earlier this year, where they invited like 10 or 20 comedians from the US and other parts of the world to Saudi to do a show. So you can see Saudi Arabia is trying to enter the sphere of the global world and not trying to isolate itself as much as it once did. Thank you.
That was beautifully said, Zohan.
Beautifully said, Demir. That was very good. I would just like to just pitch in a little bit into this conversation regarding Saudi Arabia. Yes, we know that Saudi Arabia is putting a lot of effort into diversifying into different sectors, but almost 60 to 70% of its government revenues come from oil. But to notice Saudi Arabia's efforts, Saudi Arabia was able to use its oil resources more effectively than countries like Venezuela because it invested oil revenues through its sovereign wealth fund, maintained a productive oil sector, and implemented a long-term diversification strategy through Vision 2030. By developing such industries like tourism, technology, infrastructure, and attracting foreign investment, Saudi Arabia has begun transitioning toward a more diversified economy, which we can compare to the likes of Norway. However, it still remains heavily dependent on oil, meaning the transition is still ongoing rather than complete.
Thank you so much, Rana. That was actually very insightful. I was not thinking of it in that way, but thank you so much. So, before we move on, I believe we must pause on something very significant because all of this isn't just based on the economics. It's also about how the systems are able to interact with the state and how decisions are made. So, we know how Venezuela historically operated under a more state controlled socialist model, where oil wealth was heavily redistributed through public spending and social programs. Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, is run under a centralized monarchy where decision making is far more concentrated and long term economic planning can be pushed through without the same kind of political resistance. So even though both countries depended on oil, the way decisions were made and who was making them looked very different, as well as who was able to reap the benefits of the oil. So this raises a more important question. To what extent did differences in political systems and leadership styles shape how each country managed its oil wealth? And I know, Zoomer, I know you know a lot about this topic, so I would love for you to start us off over here.
Supreet, thank you so much for this very, very beautiful and insightful question. I would be more than happy to answer this question for you. And from what I've researched, from what I've gained from my experience, especially going to Venezuela, especially going to Saudi Arabia, not so much of Norway, but I believe that to a large extent, differences in these political systems and leadership styles were central to see how each country managed its oil wealth. Venezuela, especially under Hugo Chavez, operated as a highly centralized petrostate where political goals such as redistribution and managing public transport often overrode long-term economic planning, while oil reserves were directly tied to the government spending and institutions were weakened by politis politicization, corruption, and lack of accountability. This means that decisions were often short term and reactive, making the economy extremely vulnerable to oil price shocks. And while in contrast, Saudi Arabia's monarchy concentrated power in a small leadership group, but used that control to maintain stability in oil production and pursue long-term strategies. Its oil company remained its oil company Aramco remained relatively isolated from political disruption and consistently reinvested in capacity and technology, helping sustain output and revenue over time. More recently, under Mohammed bin Salman, commonly referred to as MBS, this centralized system has enabled large-scale reforms such as Vision 2030, which we had already talked about beforehand. And also, one more key thing I just wanted to say. Demir mentioned a lot about sports washing or how Saudi Arabia invested heavily in sports. I just would like to say that that necessarily didn't have a large impact on its economy. Rather, the main goal was Vision 2030, which MBS had implemented or started to implement for a very long time. Um, while both systems for government, whether that be Chavez or whether that be MBS, were centralized, the key differences lied in between how power was used. In Venezuela, it was used for short-term redistribution and political survival, whereas Saudi Arabia, it was used as a more strategically thing for long-term planning, investment, and gradual diversification. I know I've said a lot, but I just want to ask a question to our expert here, Ishraq. Um, does that mean that a more centralized or authoritarian government or system is actually better at managing resource wealth in the long run?
Beautifully said, Zumar. Thank you very much for the insightful question. Um, whilst whilst a centralized system is has proven in this case through Saudi Arabia to be better than a authoritarian system such as Venezuela, it does not mean that it is it, it is actually entirely better, because there are many other factors that could also get into this be in this sort of decision making and everything for how the oil is managed. Um, so centralized systems, they can be effective in managing the resource uh, and the wealth in the short term to maybe a bit of long term, due to their ability to coordinate their investments very quickly and implement long-term plans quite easily, such as the Vision 2030. Um, but without strong institutions and some accountability mechanisms, centralizations kind of increases the risk of the inefficient allocation of resources, and it can make long-term decisions and plans quite uncertain, thereby making the success for these long-term plans also quite uncertain.
Thank you so much, Ishraq. So now, up to this point, we have looked at two countries that both heavily depend on oil, but the outcomes have diverged based on the leadership decisions and political systems. But what if the real difference isn't just how you use the oil, but also whether you choose to rely on it at all in the long run? And that's where Norway enters the picture. Unlike Venezuela, it didn't spend aggressively. Unlike Saudi Arabia, it didn't just double down and then try to transition later. Instead, Norway took a step back and asked a fundamentally interesting question. What if this wealth isn't meant to be used now? What Norway did was to not use uh, the oil reserves as income, but rather treat it as savings. And to better understand this, we have to go back just a bit in history and see how Norway was able to make its decisions. So, in the late 1960s, in the North Sea, Norway discovered oil, and this was a time when it was still a very modest economy. But it did not at all spend that wealth. Instead, Norwegian policymakers in a stable democratic system were able to make a conscious decision and understand that oil is in reality a very finite resource and that it wouldn't last forever. So it could never and should never be the foundation of the economy, according to Norwegian policymakers. And this is where the leadership decisions differed, both between Venezuela or Saudi Arabia and Norway, because Norway wasn't driven by just one dominant leader. Instead, the decisions were collectively decided and made through institutions, parliaments, economic advisors, and central banking authorities. That created a system where long term thinking was prioritized over the short term political gain. So then, Norway set up what is now known as its Sovereign Wealth Fund, the Government Pension Fund Global. And the idea was simple but very powerful. What they wanted to do was to invest the oil revenues abroad, grow that wealth over time, and only use a small portion of the returns each year. And today, that fund is literally one of the largest funds in the entire world. So, just there, I wanted to know, does Saudi have a larger fund than Norway's government pension fund global? That's a very interesting question. I don't know anything about this. But what's more important is how Norway's money was able to feed back into society. Instead of volatile oil revenues directly funding spending, Norway was able to use the stable returns from the fund to support public services like healthcare, education, infrastructure, and social welfare. And this was able to create a very intricate buffer against the oil price fluctuations and ensure that future generations uh, also benefited from the country's resources. So over here, I have a very more of a, this raises a very important question. Sorry, my internet's not working. Give me a second. Yes. Okay. So my question was Norway's model something that other countries could realistically replicate, or was it dependent on its unique political and economic conditions? And another thing was Norway and is Norway successful because it avoided dependence altogether, or because it managed that dependence more carefully? And lastly, what happens when a country is able to treat natural resources not just as income but as savings? Yes, Mr. Ishraq Rayan?
Yes, to answer the question of is Norway successful because, uh, like, actually, sorry, I mean, the to answer the question of can Norway's success be duplicated? Um, uh, I believe that due to Norway's unique situation of finding oil very early in the 1960s. And like back then, when oil was more of a modest economy because it wasn't used as the main primary resource for a lot of things. Um, I don't think this model can be duplicated now today. And this is due to the fact that oil now is more than ever in urgent need due to the supply shocks that are happening in this current present day with the ongoing wars. Therefore, I believe that if a country if a low income country were to find oil now, they would very highly capitalize on that very quickly to for their short term gain, rather than focus on the long term, as they would find that the short term would benefit them more in this current situation. And that's why I believe that Norway's model cannot be applied to any other country currently, simply due to how the current ongoing world situations are. Thank you.
That was pretty interesting, Ishraq. Thank you for your insightful um, opinion. I also wanted to just add on that also my bad, I forgot to mention I very much agree with you about like the fact that most countries cannot um, replicate what Norway already did. And I believe that like instead of treating oil as like a huge direct income that should immediately fuel spending, subsidies, or like short-term political goals, Norway basically what they did, they treated it as a form of national savings. And that mindset shift like is what created the government pension fund global, which I mentioned earlier. And the real strength of this whole system that they created is not just the fund, it's like how it's managed. And the government is only allowed to spend a small fixed percentage of the fund each year, meaning that the oil wealth that actually enters the society slowly and predictably enters rather than just like in a unstable way. This also creates a very important economic effect where it prevents overheating, inflation shocks, and like other political pressure to overspend during the oil booms. And instead, the oil wealth is actually gradually distributed into long-term public goods, education systems, healthcare, and infrastructure, which strengthens the society over generations rather than just one political cycle. And however, this system, like Ishraq talked about, only works because of deeper structural conditions. Norway only already had a strong like institution, and it had like low corruption, high public trust before oil was even discovered in that country. That just meant that the country had the administrative capacity to manage the massive wealth without it being like captured or like misused. And I feel like this also leads to a deeper interpretation, because Norway's success is not just about like oil management. It's mostly about like the political structure it had. And like I also like this kind of brought up a new question for me, which was like, if a country only becomes like stable after it gains wealth, but needs to already be stable in order to manage that wealth properly, then is the economic success that they got, for example, the oil one in our case, driven more by resources themselves or by the systems that existed before those resources are even discovered? So I thought that was like an interesting, thought-provoking question. I thought to just like put it out there.
Thank you, Araf, for your very insightful um, talk over here. I would like to go back to one of Supreet's questions about, is Norway successful because it avoided dependence altogether or because it managed that dependence more carefully? I believe, to answer this question, I believe we have to look at the other models that we've been presented in terms of Venezuela and Saudi Arabia. If we look at Venezuela, where they did not avoid dependence at all and they were fully dependent on it, we could see how, due to how volatile oil prices were, um, how their economy overall had a crash and a fail in the modern sense, simply due to their over dependence on oil as a whole. And then if you look at Saudi Arabia, they've now realized the situation themselves of how they cannot be overly relying on oil as their main primary source of income, and how now they're trying to use that income to diversify and open up into other sectors so that they could have a better source of managing their economy. And so to answer that question as a whole, I believe that Norway is successful because they avoided dependence altogether. Um, because they decided that instead of depending on oil in the long term as well, they're going to only rely on it in the short term and treat it as a sort of investment. uh, Treat the income that they get from the oil as a sort of investment into um, other sectors and other companies to overall grow their income as a whole. So therefore, I believe that Norway became successful because they avoided dependence altogether. And I would like to pass this on to Zohan. Thank you.
I would actually like to disagree with our very respected guest speaker, Mr. Ishraq Rayan, in the sense that I don't think Norway's success was due to avoiding oil dependence, but rather managing the dependence. So let me begin by talking. So Norway's success is not due to avoiding oil dependence, but rather to managing that dependence through strict physical discipline, strong institutions, and long-term planning. Unlike many resource-rich countries, Norway implemented a rules-based fiscal framework where only a small portion, around 3% of oil revenue, is used annually, while the rest is saved in the government pension fund global. This prevents excessive government spending and reduces exposure to volatile oil prices, allowing for counter cycle fiscal policy, saving during booms and stabilizing during downturns. By treating oil revenues as national savings rather than current income, Norway avoids the effects of the resource curse and the disease, as Ishrak had mentioned earlier in the podcast. Investing oil wealth abroad also limits currency appreciation, protecting the competitiveness of non oil sectors such as manufacturing and services. This approach ensures intergenerational equity, meaning that future citizens benefit from finite natural resources rather than current generation exhausting them. However, while aspects of Norway's model, such as sovereign wealth funds and fiscal rules, can be adopted by other countries, its full success depends on unique structural conditions. Norway benefits from low corruption, high transparency, strong rule of law, and high levels of social trust, which enables consistent long term policy making. Additionally, it discovered oil after establishing a diverse and developed economy, meaning institutions were already strong. In contrast, many developing countries face political instability and short term pressures that make disciplined saving difficult. Therefore, although Norway's model provides a valuable framework, its replication is constrained by differences in governance, institutional quality, and economic context. So, I would like for other countries to integrate the way Norway has integrated their economy, um, meaning that they're not that dependent on oil. But it's very difficult as Norway strives from a low corrupted government, high transparency, and listening to their people and their citizens.
Zohan, well said. That was a very thoughtful
I can
insight.
smell your breath, Demir. Oh,
No, no, don't do this.
Zuma, I don't know what you're doing. Wait, let me. Anyways, very thoughtful insight from
Thank you
Zohan
for
there.
Zuma. Would you like to go next?
no, I'm okay. I want the stinky breath guy to just like keep going until all his stinky breath is gone. Do you have any mouthwash?
Are you gonna let me talk, or are you gonna continue interrupting me, Zohan?
Demir, I wasn't speaking for like 3 seconds. You could have easily unmuted.
Well, shush. Now let me speak.
Wait. Let him speak. Let him speak.
Okay, thank you, Zohan, for that very thoughtful insight. So, in seeing that Norway's model was only created due to unique circumstances, I want to pose a question. Do we think that there is one universal model that could help all countries deal with oil production and oil reliance, or do we think that the model will change depending on what country? Do we believe that there is a model that could what save Venezuela from their plight? Like that was the question I want to pose. Ishak?
I believe yes, there is a model that could be used, and I believe that what Norway did is can sort of set an example for other countries that have similar sort of endeavors in terms of having a one resource economy. Um, I believe what Norway did in terms of the diversification is what other countries should be striving to do as well, as other countries which their primary resource that is um, growing their economy, uh, if they use that income as sort of a investment for their sectors, for other sectors of the economy that they have, I think that would be a better sort of way of using their income from that certain resource, rather than just using it in just the short run and using it for uh, other projects within the government.
Wow, Demir, that was an absolutely beautiful question. In fact, I cannot believe how beautiful that question was. So, to answer that question, which is so beautiful, is Venezuela can exactly copy Norway's model, but they can implement a hybrid model combining Norway's fiscal discipline and sovereign wealth fund approach with Saudi's active diversification strategy. This would involve saving a large proportion of oil revenues in a transparent fund, investing it in non oil sectors such as agriculture and manufacturing sectors, and attracting foreign investment. However, the success of such a model depends primarily on strengthening institutions, reducing corruption, and ensuring political stability. Without these conditions, even well designed economic policies are unlikely to be effective, even in the best countries in the world. Mr.
Uh,
Araf, would you like to say anything?
yeah, thank you, Zohan, for that insightful answer to Demir's question. I kind of like that idea of that hybrid solution where you actually mixed up Norway's and Saudi's economic and political situation to implement into Venezuela. I just want to add on that in the case of Venezuela, the first step would be like you said, would be the economic stabilization, which means restoring the basic macroeconomic control, which reduces hyperinflation, stabilizing the currency, and rebuilding trust in financial institutions. And next, Venezuela would also need to have a major debt restructuring. The country carries an extremely large external debt burden, and without reducing or reorganizing that debt, it's very difficult for any recovery to take place. And third, the most importantly, it needs to rebuild its oil sector entirely. Venezuela still has enormous reserves, but the thing is, the production has fallen sharply. And restarting the production would require foreign investment, technical expertise, and rebuilding the infrastructure that has been neglected for years. The key point here I'm trying to say is that oil alone is not enough. We've been constantly saying this throughout this whole meeting. A sustainable recovery would also require diversification and developing industries beyond oil so the entire economy doesn't collapse again when prices fluctuate. Finally, the long-term stability depends on institutions. So without stronger governance, rule of law, and more consistent economic policy, even high oil revenues won't translate into lasting development throughout for the country's future. So the solution, like Zohan you mentioned, isn't just about money or resources. It's about rebuilding the entire economic system around them, and maybe also use an hybridized approach, which Mr. Zohaan Rana mentioned. So yeah, I just wanted to put that out there too. And Demir, I see your hand raised. Would you like to say something? Also, thank you for patiently waiting for me to finish speaking. So yeah.
Uh, yeah, no problem, Arf. I noticed how in all of these models we see government at the forefront, we see state ran economies. What I want to pose is, do you guys think there's a solution which is more free market, which is more based on the workings of the market forces at these type of things rather than the government running everything? Like that's the question I think that we need to discuss. I know
Ishak,
who
going to answer.
owns everything.
Ishak, you can answer the question. I believe you know a lot about Venezuela and the free market, as you're a pioneer for capitalism and love America, the American dream.
And you're an economics HL student.
To answer the question that Demir, this very insightful and beautiful question that Demir posed, um, I would like to I would like to bring into the factor that in macroeconomics, it's been a very sort of debate about the Keynesian and the neoclassical models of how to run an economy, where the neoclassical model argues for more of a uh, free market economy versus the Keynesian model, which is arguing for more government intervention, more fiscal policies, and more monetary restrictions. Um, in this case, for Venezuela's case, I believe that um, the failure was a result of poor fiscal policies and poor management from the government as a whole. And I believe that a free market solution also wouldn't do much better in this case, simply due to the fact that um, even in the case of free market, uh, uh, a free market Venezuela, the oil dependency wouldn't change, and the overall economy would still be very oil dependent, and the other sectors of economy would be much less. It would be less invested into, and it'd be less developed as a whole. Therefore, I believe that a better management of the government uh, be would prove as a better solution for Venezuela the rather than a free market solution.
Ishak, that was some amazing input. I think we should
Just
now.
to just to answer Demir's question, as it was a beautiful question. In fact, I cannot believe such a beautiful question can come out of his mouth. But anyways,
Bro,
I would like I would like to answer Demir's beautiful question. Yes, Venezuela could adopt a free market approach by removing price controls, protecting private property, opening its economy to trade and foreign investment, and privatizing parts of its oil sector. These reforms would restore market mechanisms, improve efficiency, and ultimately encourage production. However, the success of such a model depends on strong institutions, political stability, and investor confidence, which Venezuela usually lacks. Without these conditions, free market reforms alone are unlikely to resolve Venezuela's economic crisis. Thank you.
Zohaan
Okay,
Rana, thank
so
you so much
oh,
for
sorry.
the insightful input. Supreeth, I think you should take over at this point.
Sure. Before I do the final wrap up, is there anything important that you guys would like to share?
I think as a whole, for this episode, I think we need to understand that the talk on about how a resource is managed is very it's very much based on the leadership and the government and the political stability, and there are many factors to it. Therefore, this sort of question cannot be fully answered within this episode. But I believe that the overall consensus is that a diversification of the economy is a better economy than a economy that is very reliant on only a single resource.
Thank you so much, Ishraq. So, Mr. Ryan, thank you. So, when we step back and now look at all the three cases, Venezuela, Saudi, and Norway, it becomes clear that this isn't just a story about oil. because all three had access to the same resource, all three had the same opportunity to generate massive wealth, but the outcomes were very different depending on everything around the resource, the type of oil, the cost structures, the political systems, and more importantly, the decisions leaders chose to make. So maybe the real takeaway is this. It's not about what a country has, it's about how it chooses to manage it. It's not just limited to oil. We have diamonds in Africa, we have uh, rare earth, rare minerals in these other nations that are sort of being exploited by foreign nations, and it's a food for thought. And before we wrap up, I just want to bring in Ishraq again to see if there's anything else he would like to add about the Dollar Dialogue podcast.
Um, I think this podcast is a great podcast where we can discuss about a lot of economics and the economical situation of the world, and like we can analyze it in a very, um, in a very sort of economical way. And I believe that when we look at the world this way, we can come into we can bring up more solutions that could possibly one day be heard by by someone, and one day be uh, used by someone as well.
Yes,
Ishraq,
so
thank you so much for attending our podcast episode. We are so happy and we are all so lucky to have you as our esteemed expert on this topic. Thank you once again from everyone's behalf. Thank you.
and Zohan.
Again, I would like to emphasize the honor we had to include a wonderful guest speaker, Mr. Ishraq Rayan, who's very credible when it comes to economics and also business. He is thinking about pursuing finance in the Ivy Leagues in the US, and also he is an economics higher level student in the IBDP program. So we are very grateful to have him as a guest, and we're very grateful for him to share his very informational insights on our beautiful podcast.
And with that, this has been Dollar Dialogue Episode 2, Season 2. Leaders who bet on one industry: Chavez, MBS, and Norway's model. Oil dependence versus diversification. Thank you, viewers, for listening. Next week, we are back with another very good episode with another very good guest speaker. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next one.